Kia ora e te whānau, ko Sally Angelson toko ingoa. It really is a pleasure to be sharing with you today my experiences and insights into the field of peace education and offering some thoughts from my personal perspective as to the incredible opportunities working in this space can offer. I'm so sorry I can't be there with you in person. So I appreciate that this is an impersonal way of being connected, but I hope to share with you some of the real stories of what peace education in action looks like through my journey and through 3 case studies. I've peppered some questions throughout to get you all thinking, so you can pause when they come about and have a chat. They're about some aspects and issues that I would happily answer any question or thoughts about in the future. The structure of this lecture will be in a few parts. Firstly, questioning the purpose of peace education, then looking at my journey of how I became involved, then a more in-depth look through some case studies from Sudan, from Zambia, and from Lebanon, and a couple of little shorter things in there too, and then finishing with some consideration of what this work looks like and hopefully something that you may be interested in exploring more. So we'll get started. So firstly, the purpose of peace education and what to do with it. So there are so many potential purposes and opportunities that a good education can provide. To love to learn, to listen, to critically analyse information, to question, to use your voice and agency, to reason, and to imagine your place in the future. It is also a critical time in life from age 3, hopefully, until 18 or beyond, to form your sense of self, of identity, and of place. So it's where you learn to have opinions, to form social behaviours, to learn about the world outside your family or community, and to grapple with the notions of belonging and trust, confidence, things like that. So I guess for us in New Zealand, this time's challenging. And for people who have experienced forced migration, conflict, trauma, isolation, vulnerability, it's sometimes overwhelming. So does peace education offer a way to imagine the world beyond your current circumstances? I think it does. Does having an education based in human rights, non-discrimination, and tools for resolving conflict in favour of peace offer an alternative way of understanding the world? Johan Galtung, one of my favourites, offered that peace education should not be only general knowledge, but conclude with something that students can do. And I love this idea. So, for example, when a health education leads to hygienic practices, same for peace. So for this to happen, our peace concepts have to come closer to the level at which people live, the local level. And this is something that I really believe in. So there's questions that I asked myself through these various geographies and realities I have witnessed during my years in this field. But before I go further into my journey and some of the people and places I've experienced, I want to ask you a question. So think about this. What would you consider the 3 most important outcomes for an individual in finishing secondary school? Just take 5 minutes and talk to a partner about this. What are the 3 most important outcomes that you think somebody should have when they graduate from secondary school? So just remember those, and we'll come back to those later on in the lecture. So I'm going to go now just into a little bit of my background of how I got involved in the sector. I hope this is interesting for you all. So I'm just going to go back in time a bit to run through how it all started. So I grew up in Whirianga on the Coromandel Peninsula up north, and I had a fairly sheltered upbringing. I went to an area school For those of you who don't know what that is, you start and finish at the same school. There is no intermediate or high school. It's all the same thing. I didn't even have to change schools. So on top of that, no one in my family had ever gone to university, and I wasn't sure what to choose for the very few careers I knew about. I knew about accountancy or nursing or that kind of thing, but I didn't know that much more of what was out there. Then when I was 14, a group from the American Field Scholarship came to our school and told me that I could go to the other side of the world for a year and study. And I was like, sign me up. So I did. I put my hand up and I was chosen to go to Iceland, which I had to look in an atlas and find out where that was because I'd never heard of it. And at the age of 17, I went over there for a year and went to school. So at a fairly formative age, I experienced being an outsider, being a non-native language speaker, being a worker. I had to work in the local sheepskin factory in the mornings to earn my keep, and a teacher. So my fortunately, my English teacher was an alcoholic and slept for most of the class. So he suggested that I taught the English curriculum. So I ended up teaching Pygmalion in 1984, both excellent books. But my world really opened up. So I returned to New Zealand and I did a degree in international relations. The day after I graduated, I left the country and did a variety of jobs. I worked for the government in the UK for a little while. I worked on private yachts in France. I did a whole bunch of things. And there was something in me that always wanted to go into teaching. So I did my teaching certificate in English teaching, and I fell in love with teaching and learning and all the different ways the roles of learners and teachers can be understood and how to make learning fun and meaningful. So I did that for a few years across UK, New Zealand, and Japan, and then I landed a teaching job on an NGO ship called the Peace Boat. Please look it up if you haven't heard of it. So I guess this is where my sort of journey became more interesting, in my opinion. So the Peace Boat, it's a ship. It was started back in 1983 when a couple of university students from Waseda University in Tokyo initiated the Peace Boat as an answer to the many inconsistencies that then existed in the history textbooks in Japan, which really misrepresented what happened during World War II and in other areas. And they believed that by bringing people together to have dialogue, that they would be able to break down some of the barriers of misinformation and propaganda. And so being in international waters, as a ship is, it was a neutral meeting place for people from either sides of conflicts, a floating university, and for me it was life-changing. So this idea that started in 1983 grew and grew and grew, and the ship, until COVID, was constantly circumnavigating the globe, stopping at about 15 countries each voyage, and looking at different issues affecting social, economic, political issues that were happening in those countries. So I spent 4 years on that ship, firstly as a teacher and then as a coordinator of the international programs, and I was able to see and visit over 50 countries in that time. It opened my eyes to the differences across the world, but it also really opened my eyes to the similarities that humans have across the globe. We all want to have a life of safety and prosperity. We want to care for our people and have a good life. And the place where you were born often determine the outcome for you, and inequalities are everywhere. So after 4 years of that, I learnt a variety of things, including working with young people from Israel, Palestine, from Serbia, Bosnia, from different conflicts, and hearing firsthand what the realities of their lives, the narratives, the identities that they hold very dear, how that plays out in a world of peace and conflict. But I guess after 4 years, I saw so many different countries, and I wanted to take what I'd learnt and really focus that down into how I could participate in solutions to such injustices and inequalities. So this is where, I guess, the peace education journey really started. So from 2004, I worked from the UK in countries affected by conflict, such as Uganda, Sierra Leone, Lebanon with the Palestinian refugees, and in Sudan. So I'll pause the timeline to just take a moment to go into the first case study, which is the IDPs, or the internally displaced people of Sudan. So this is back in 2004, so it's a little while ago. I'm sure things have changed since then. But when I first visited Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, in 2004, I was really shocked at what I saw. The sprawling camps for internally displaced people, mostly from the south at that time, were a result of a long, protracted, bloody, brutal civil war that had lasted 20 years, more in fact, with around 7 million people being forced migrants, and around 2 million of those being trapped in limbo in camps around Khartoum. So the camps were in a desert. They were dusty. They were hard to navigate. There was no running water or sanitation. The dwellings were either made from sort of constructed sticks and bags, or homemade bricks that were turned into small buildings. The government didn't want them there, so they periodically would sweep through with bulldozers, flattening them, with the residents just left there to rebuild. So they were nearly solely reliant on outside help, with the UN and many, many NGOs present. So lots of children were born into these camps, as well as those having escaped from being forced combatants, and having faced untold other traumas to get there. So within these camps, the organisation I worked for, which was called Education Action, ran 14 of these schools. So the schools were primary, mainly grades 1 to 8, and the curriculum was a bit of a mishmash of British curriculum. The lingua franca from the south was English, and in the north was Arabic. But the references were very old. They really didn't bear resemblance to the life around them. I remember one teacher had been teaching Jane Eyre every year, and said that there were similarities in the some of the challenges that they faced, but really Jane Eyre is a world away from the camps of Khartoum. So there were books donated from well-meaning people from all over the world, but they didn't necessarily fit a grade system or subjects. And so teachers, some of them had little or no training, did their best, and had the most pride and dignity of any people that I've ever met. From their dwellings that I described before, they would come out wearing beautiful white pressed shirts that they would press with an old-fashioned iron that had coal on the top, and walk with their backs straight, with this pride that they were teachers and that they were part of the solution for some of the children that were really suffering. So our role in supporting these schools was in teacher training. Part of what I did was organised exchange visits between teachers in the UK and teachers in Sudan. And this was really to just, I guess, consider the way in which teachers could teach, whether the resources were there or not. Also considering disabilities. Obviously, within those situations, there is a range of disabilities. And also thinking about how to make locally appropriate resources when those weren't there. And then within the schools were the students themselves. So some of them were as old as 30, having never had a chance to learn before, and starting at grade 1. So you can imagine how that might feel for a 30-year-old to sit side by side with a 6-year-old. Some of them had been forced combatants who'd witnessed horrors. There was a lot of depression, withdrawn people. There was aggression. Some had hope. And a lot of the hope was living on this promise of returning to the south, where I was told that there were lush green forests and mangoes dropped off the trees, and the villages were really places of family and community, and it was a good life. And one day they would return there. And I think that reality was almost mythologized into a point of fantasy and hope. So then in 2005, when the peace agreement was signed, there was a lot of people returning. Some just sent one member of the family, often the father, to go in advance to find that actually the land was ruined. There was landmines everywhere, no infrastructure, health or education, and often not even a landmark to demarcate where their hometown was. So people then returned to the camps, to the relative safety and support offered by the international community, but there was that loss of hope. And so this was a really challenging and tough tough time to be in there. And the schools remained that place of safety and routine that really kept people going at that time. I just want to stop before I talk about some of the good things that came out from the education in that time, and just ask you a question. So, how would you approach this? What do you think might be a possibility? So, the question is this: what role could education play for people such as these? And thinking, I guess, about identity, about purpose and future. How does this reflect the ability to build peace and a future as democratic citizens? So I might just pause again here, and you can either just have a think about that or maybe have a bit of a discussion in your group as to some of those points. So what role could education play for situations such as this, especially thinking about identity, purpose, and future? And how does this reflect the ability to build peace and a future as active democratic citizens? Okay, great. So the results were in the camps there. The results were that the schools were the place where there was relative safety and routine, as I said. It was a place to talk freely and use your voice in a positive and constructive way to consider the future. It was a place to consider the futility and loss caused by war and the opportunities for rebuilding a new and more peaceful tomorrow. It was both the content, which was a combination of the formal resources and those built by teachers, parents, and students themselves, but also mentoring, peer support, and outreach to others. So I guess today, there are many people who have now returned to the South, the new country of South Sudan, I think the second youngest country in the world. But there are struggles that obviously continue. And I just saw a report that UNESCO stated that those education stakeholders in South Sudan and the global development community really need to recognise the need to integrate conflict management and disaster risk reduction in education for that population. So, yeah, that was the first case study for me in Sudan. So following my work there, I returned to New Zealand, and I'd been away at that point for about 12 years and began working with Child Fund New Zealand. Initially, I was the Global Schools Coordinator. So I used the same sort of exchange approach that I'd used between the UK and Sudan, and took that approach with some schools that we were supporting in Zambia. So this resulted in my writing of a program called ATLAS, which is the Active Teaching and Learning Approaches in Schools program. I thought of the acronym first and then the words later. I imagined Atlas holding a book on his shoulders. And for this program, I partnered with international education experts, and collaboration, I think, is the key to all of this. But these experts were through the International Reading Association. The acronym, unfortunately, was IRA. But these were a network of educationalists across the globe with specialist skills in themes of education or specific locations. So collaboration really is the key, and local knowledge is the key, I would say. So I just want to take you on a second case study of Zambia. This is a slightly different place because it's not as such conflict, but it is that vulnerability and exclusion from quality education. So this one was started in an area of Zambia called Mumbwa, and Child Fund had been supporting the infrastructure of schools for a few years. But in discussions with the local community, there'd been a locally identified need for the improvement of teacher training and skills, as well as a modernising of the approach to teaching and learning. So there were high incidents of corporal punishment, of dropouts, parents really not recognising the benefit of education. Perhaps they hadn't had a good education themselves, low pass rates, and the environment of the school was not particularly friendly for children. So there was a call to shift the power within the schools from being teacher-led to being student-led or child-friendly schools. So this was quite a radical shift in Zambia, and it had to be paced. So I felt extremely fortunate to be part of this shift, and so did a bit of research beforehand on some very good examples of child-centred schools. And one of those places was in the highlands of Colombia, an organisation called Escuela Nueva, or New Schools. I think has probably some of the best child-centred schools learning approaches that I've seen anywhere. So they focus on rural and multi-grade classrooms. And so when you come to the school, you're greeted at the gate by the school leader, who I remember one school was about 7 years old. And she introduced me very confidently to her elected ministers. So there was a minister for the environment, a minister for health, a minister for peace, and they were all kids. Oh, and a minister for rubbish. That kid was quite serious. And we also considered, how we could take this kind of approach to a different context. But so just with that school, it was there was a beautiful big mural that was painted on the side of the wall, mapping showing like safety zones for children around the community and danger zones. There were suggestion boxes. There were walls of gratitude where children would be, a photo would be put up of a child for something that they'd done really well, that helped another child to learn, etc. And it was just a really positive learning environment. It was sort of the extreme of really children running the school, and the teachers there said that they were in the background, but it was a really interesting approach. Anyway, so back to Zambia. So we took that kind of learning, and then we also considered a child rights approach. So considering the Convention on the Rights of the Child, especially in areas such as, right to quality education, to having an opinion that is heard, to protecting minority groups, to developing their personalities and skills and talents, and obviously to be protected. So all these ideas were discussed with the local teachers, parents, ministries of education representatives, and children, of course, and it was decided to pilot this new approach in 12 schools. So over a year, it began with an exchange between those New Zealand and Zambian teachers in trying each other's approach to teaching and making it fun and non-threatening. For a teacher who has always been in control of the class and has been the bearer of knowledge and the holder of knowledge, who imparts that knowledge to the students and is not interrupted, etc., it's quite a shift to then sort of, relinquish some of that control and let the students lead the inquiry. So by partnering up with New Zealand teachers, the focus was really on the topic that would be taught, and then how that could be done in a way that might, complement both the approaches to start with. So not like diving right into, having to roll around on the ground being silly, but just in stages. And so there was an exchange. The New Zealand teachers first came to Zambia and they were partnered up. And for 2 weeks, they had a topic. They would teach that topic, and then at the end of the day, reflect and think, what worked well, what didn't. Maybe tomorrow we could try something slightly different. And then slowly sort of tried to share each other's approaches to teaching and learning. Then those teachers came back to New Zealand and also experienced what life was like in a New Zealand classroom, while also really, offering their assets and their skills and their knowledge from that Zambian perspective, which the teachers in New Zealand learnt just as much from. So it was a really positive two-way exchange. And then the formal training started, which introduced some of those techniques into the shift. And they did this in a peer model. So you would learn as a group, but you would be assigned to a peer. And in the times between the formal trainings, that peer would come and watch you and then assess your class. You'd go to their class and assess them. So it was quite an even sort of field there, and that was tried and tested, and then they would go back and do some more formal learning. So all this took about a year, in which the pilot teachers graduated as trainer of trainers, who could then go on and train other teachers. So slowly the approach gained traction in quite a locally articulated way, and the changes started to be seen. So over a period of 3 years, those pilot schools saw dropout rates hugely decrease. Child rights clubs started. That wasn't an initial intention, but that came out of it and continues today. Excuse me. And representatives of those clubs started to be seen in community committees, and teachers were wanting to teach in these schools, and parents were wanting their kids to go to these schools. So a lot of changes in there. And one teacher commented that this was the shift from being the bus driver with the kids in the back of his bus as he drove them along his knowledge journey, to really jumping on the bus with the kids and going through that journey together. So I really like that. So that program, the Atlas program, is now a national program in Zambia and also in Sri Lanka, and it's introduced in teacher training colleges. So that's cool. And I just wanted to stop again and just ask a question. And again, you can just have a think about it or have a chat between yourselves. The question is this: is Atlas an example of peace education? If so, how? If not, why not? Okay. So back on the journey again, and we're going to go to a third case study in a moment. So since introducing Atlas, I've had the opportunity to work in the area of education and broader community development with children and youth at the centre in many countries across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and including here in Aotearoa. And so I love this work, and I'm a firm believer in pracademia and bringing together the practice and the academic. And so I wanted to do a little bit more of that critical analysis in the academic sense. And so in 2010, I went back to university in Auckland, and I decided to explore a little bit more critically the role between education and peace building, what the relationship was between the two. So for this, I went back to a place where I had worked before, which was in Lebanon, and I guess somewhere that is very dear to me, the Palestinians refugee population that live in Lebanon. So having worked with them before, I was lucky enough to be allowed to come and teach with the children in Shatila camp in Beirut for 3 months. I felt like before commenting or researching or having any opinions on a population, I needed to really listen. Listening is the key. So I went over there for 3 months, and I don't know if any of you know about Shatila camp, but it is the place of a lot of controversy. So number one, it's small. It's about 1 square kilometre, or the size of a cricket pitch field. And at the time, there were about 12,000 people living there. That's disputed because they're not recorded, but very cramped. And so just a little bit of background there. After the war with Israel in 1948, when Palestinians were displaced, a lot of them were welcomed into neighbouring countries as temporary guests. But 70 odd years is quite a long time to be a guest, and they're still there. They still hold papers identifying themselves as Palestinian refugees. They are barred by law in Lebanon from becoming engineers, doctors, lawyers, any of the main occupations. Around 70 occupations are banned by law. So really that only gives the opportunity to work in quite low-level jobs. So they're still the only refugee population in the world to have their own UN agency dedicated to them. This is largely due to the time that it was set up, UNRWA, which is their agency, the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, was formed in 1949. All other refugees internationally falling under the protection of the UNHCR, which was formed in 1951. So within Lebanon, there are many camps. Shatila is the one that I focused my time in. There are schools within the camps that are UNRWA schools, which broadly follow the curriculum of the host country, but they are overlaid with a bespoke curriculum for Palestinian refugees. So the UNRWA curriculum framework emphasizes the importance of reflecting the UN values such as neutrality, human rights, tolerance, equality, and non-discrimination with regard to race, gender, language, religion throughout the teaching and learning process in UNRWA schools. And I point that out to say that in terms of education and peace building, I guess the fact that a refugee population has that overlay in their curriculum, but the host country doesn't necessarily, perhaps can perpetuate the differences. But it was a very interesting thing to look into. How does that play out? So my time in the camp there was very intense, but I was warmly welcomed. There was an omnipresence of the situation that they faced every day. So there was a huge picture in the center of the camp of Yasser Arafat, who was then the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Army, who was in the camp, and he was wanted by many people, Israel, also factions within Lebanon, and there was a massacre that took place in the camp where I think 3,500 is roughly estimated to be the number that were killed, but that number again is disputed. But that still remains like a daily thing. There's a board there with people's names on it and a picture of Yasser Arafat still hanging. People still hold the key to the house that they left in 1948 or 1949. Mothers told me that they breastfeed their children the right of return to a land and a time that no longer exists. In the camp itself, buildings were falling down. There was a ban on materials coming in. There were open sewers. There's lawlessness as the police in Lebanon doesn't police inside the camps. And a wonderful academic and writer, Rosemary Sayer, writes about the permanent impermanence of the Palestinian refugee population. She calls them expellees rather than refugees, and the notions of home versus house. And I think that really plays into the idea of identity and belonging, and how education can play a part in that. So there were young children who I taught when I was there who have big dreams, just like anybody else. They threw me a surprise party on my birthday. I don't know how they knew it was my birthday, but it was. There was drumming. They whipped around and bought a birthday cake for me. And they were kids. They were naughty. They were silly. They were upset some days. They were falling in love. They were doing all the things that kids do. But they really didn't have much sense of what the future was going to bring for them. So in the schools, there's high dropout rates. Families didn't really see the point of education with no jobs at the end. So this is a bit of a grim example, but I really just want you to think about this in terms of what role education has to play in situations such as these. So I've got another question for you, and I'm going to pause and ask you this question. So how does this reflect the ability to build peace, a future home, and contribute to active democratic citizens? How can education have a role in building peace, a future home, and contributing to active democratic citizens going forward? I'm just going to pause while you have talk about that. Okay, so my reflections on that is that education has so much more to offer than just skills for a job. I think it's a place to discuss ideas, how to navigate those ideas in an uncertain future. It has the ability to imagine a world outside and consider potential future pathways. I certainly think it has the ability to talk about ways to achieve a more peaceful future and to put that into practice. And I guess I go back to what Galtung was saying, in that there has to be an action. So it's not just about talking about these ideas, but putting some of these ideas into action, and through a critical lens, through learning how to use your voice effectively and democratically. So I think school and education is also a place where your identity is challenged and your sense of belonging is formed. So I guess in short, it has the potential to enable young people to thrive or to remain stuck and somewhat hopeless. I think it depends on the quality of the curriculum, the teaching, the learning, the environment, but it certainly has the potential to build and breed peace. So I guess sort of to wrap this up a little bit, the last part that I wanted to talk about is, I guess, some things that have inspired me and what I might recommend or advise in going into this field. So I've had the opportunity to work and share with many different people with worldviews, different realities, different locations, and for that I feel very grateful. If I was to name one inspiring person for this work, it is a young boy called Sebastian. So in South Sudan, his village was raided, his family was killed in front of him, and he managed to escape into the bush along with other boys and girls. They're known as the Lost Boys, but there were girls there too. So he was 11 when he was displaced, and he lived in the bush for years with his fellow kids. And it was there that he became the self-appointed principal of their school. And he had a daily schedule for learning. They used sticks and stories. When I met him, he was 17, and he was in a town called Yei in South Sudan. And his dream was to pass high school and to become a teacher. So the organisation I was with at the time, they helped him to achieve that. And the last I heard, he was teaching successfully. And I guess this just sort of goes to show that, I don't know, for me, education is so much more than just the subjects. It has the ability to heal, to bind people together, to prepare for an uncertain future. And I find this field to be endlessly inspiring. There's one other example that I have from Zambia. I went there, another part of Zambia called Luangwa. We're working in a school there called Kapochi School. And I heard this drumming coming from outside. And these kids sort of like interrupted the meeting that we had. And the principal, very awesome, cool guy, he's like, what's going on? Can we help you? And the girl, she was the head girl, she said, you're having this meeting. I want to be heard. I was like, great. What have you got to say? And she said that her sister was disabled and is left at home, and she has nowhere to go, and it's not fair. And she had organised a drumming campaign around her village and locale, saying, bring your children out. Just because you've got disabilities doesn't mean that you don't have a right to education. And so listening to her and talking with a bunch of different people, it was decided that that would be the site of the first school for children with disabilities in Zambia. There was one school over in the west which had a school for blind children, but there was no school for children with disabilities. And so it took a while. The Ministry of Education, the secretary right at the top, was informed and agreed, and there were teachers trained in special needs training, and the school opened because a girl had learned to use her voice, had spoken articulately, and had spoken up for people that were less fortunate than her. And so these two kids for me are a real reminder to listen. Katarina had asked me to share some thoughts for anyone thinking to go into this field, and I would undoubtedly say, listen before considering any solutions. My grandma told me that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and I hold that with me every day. I guess for the more real the education experience is to those who participate in it, the more it reflects their realities and their context, the more it speaks to them, the better. I think that there are so many cross learnings that can be taken from all corners of the world. And peace education really offers an excellent framework, which can then be contextualized and continually adjusted according to the learners and the shifting world around all of us. So I feel that the job of a teacher is a facilitator and a conductor of this system, which needs to be driven by the learners themselves. But for me, I think it's endlessly fascinating, and I encourage anybody who has a love for education like me to go into this field. I just want to go back quickly before I close off to talk about those 3 core outcomes that you articulated in the beginning of this lecture, around the 3 most important outcomes any individual should come out with at the end of their secondary school graduation, at the end of that secondary school journey. I just wonder if there are any changes to those, whether it could lead to a discussion for your class around the really core values, outcomes to come out from education. So I'll close there. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts and experiences with you. If you have any thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share with me, I'd love to hear from you. But I wish all of you good luck for your studies, for your future, and for your journeys in the peace education field. Ngā mihi nui.